My name is John Pisalis, and welcome to this week's episode of the Move Smartly Show. Today, we're going to be talking about a very old idea and solution to high housing costs that has found renewed interest in recent years. And I'm talking about land value taxes. A land value tax is different from a property tax because property taxes are taxes on the value of the land and the property on that land, whereas land value taxes only tax land. They do not tax any improvement. And the idea is if you're not taxing the improvement, you encourage more housing and more housing construction. Now, economists as far back as Adam Smith and David Ricardo have been big advocates of land value taxes, but the idea really took off actually in the late 1800s with a book titled Progress and Poverty by political economist Henry George. And the big advocates of land value taxes are actually referred to as Georgists after Henry George. Now, land value taxes are a very unique and interesting policy because it has advocates both on the left and right end of the political spectrum. Economists like Milton Friedman and Joseph Stiglitz have come out speaking in favor of land value taxes. Now, today, we're going to be speaking with Floyd Marinesco, who's behind a Canadian think tank called Commonwealth Canada that advocates for a land value tax to address some of the challenges in Canada's own housing market. Floyd's going to help us unpack and better understand some of the thinking behind land value taxes and what lessons we can maybe apply to our own housing challenges here in Canada. As always, if you have any questions of your own, you can always email me at askjohn@movesmartly.com. And now on to today's show. Before we kind of get into the weeds of what land value taxes are, how we see them impacting housing, I think it'd be helpful to kick off with maybe getting an idea of what you see are some of the problems today that current policies or tax systems are not addressing, and where you think land value tax could help. So I guess the first question is like, what are the problems you see in our society today? And then we'll chat a little bit about how land value tax might help that.
Okay, well, we have a lot of problems as you're a prolific Twitter commentator. But Canada's faced so many crises right now. We have a productivity crisis, we have a housing cost crisis, we have a poverty crisis. A lot of these things intersect with our relationship to housing and to land. Looking at going a bit deeper on housing, you've said a couple times on your Twitter feed that that investors set the floor on pricing, which has the impact of displacing the actual real costs that families might want to pay to live there. We have just rampant speculation we've seen during COVID driving up pricing beyond people's actual need to live. So I think we have a market that is a bit disjointed from the real cost of housing versus people need to live versus what we're doing to it because we're treating homes as a financialized asset, as an investment vehicle. So these are some of the issues, and these also drives poverty. I mean, the number one driver of poverty is rising housing prices. We have a lot of people who are house poor, who have jobs and are still basically living on the edge. And it really shouldn't be that way. Like there's solutions have been known since the beginnings of capitalism, and that's where land value tax comes in. It's been known by hundreds of years of classical economists. If you go on it big, if you go on it small, it can help with some of the incentives that are withholding, causing land to remain underutilized, not getting enough development where it's needed. But it's really it's not a panacea, but it intersects with all these different crises. Also crisis of productivity. A lot of people say we're taxed too high. It really depends on what's being taxed. A lot of people from who have a background in land value tax believe we should reduce taxes on productivity, like income tax, corporate tax, property taxes, instead have taxes on land because they don't distort the economy. That could go a long way to improving the attractiveness of Canada and its competitiveness on a world stage. So these are some of the problems that intersect with this conversation.
That's super helpful. And I think you touched on an important point where, I mean, I think a lot of people hear about taxes and taxes potentially increasing. No one wants that happening. And I think an important point that you raise is that, in an ideal world, maybe land taxes are higher, but income taxes are lower. And I think that is part of the framework behind kind of the thinking with land value taxes, correct?
That's right. I mean, no one out there is proposing just raising a tax and just funding more government. It's
Mhm.
always a tax shift. The mayor of Detroit is proposing to reduce property taxes and increase a tax specifically on land value, claiming it'll leave 97% of households better off financially. We have our own estimations that I can share later in the show that show that on average most people are better off. And yeah, it's really about finding a system that doesn't punish productivity. If anything, it just makes it a bit harder have valuable resources be underutilized, and that's frankly better for everyone.
Okay, that's super helpful. Now that we got a bit of an idea of the problems, maybe if you can kind of unpack what a land value tax is and how it's different from property taxes, just so our users can kind of wrap their heads around what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So, a land value tax is a type of property tax. Some critics would say, well, we already pay it, it's baked into the property tax, but not really, because the property tax really penalizes you as you improve your property. If you add extensions, if you put a building somewhere, you suddenly pay more property tax, which is penalizing productivity, versus a land tax is on the unimproved value of land without any developments on it. And it is easy to get those estimations. British Columbia does it. It's a world leader in that regard. You can look up any address in BC and see its land value separate from its property value. So that is pretty easy to do. But psychologically, when you're paying just a property tax, you don't really think about land conservation. You don't really think about those things. It's just a penalizing tax. It would be much better if we separated those, had the land tax portion listed at a different rate than property tax, and then you could tweak that and see what happens there. It's important to note the impact of land value, I guess, is going back to the problems. Now, we look at the average person's expenses. They think it's housing, they think it's mortgages, but it's actually land. I mean, land is the biggest portion of the value of a home. It's the biggest portion of the value of a mortgage payment, the biggest portion of the value of a rent. It's the value that's attributed to the land. And a very simple way to think of land tax is, if you tax something, it's worth less. So if you tax the value of land, its return over time is less. People will pay less to buy it. The price of land comes down depending on how high the land tax goes. And we could be doing that instead of taxing people's incomes from their jobs in order to bring prices down low, reduce down payments, reduce the cost to acquire land, and eliminate other taxes like developer charges and all those things that we talk about a lot on your show. But yeah, sorry, I went on, but it's a tax on the unimproved value of land. It's kind of in the property tax now, but not really. Another important nuance is that tenants are paying a 100% land tax right now. It's baked into their rent. What do I mean by 100% land tax? This goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. The rental value of land is part of the rent someone pays. When you're renting, you're renting the property and the land. So a land tax is thought of as taxing the rent of land. So a landlord's portion of rent they receive, the portion attributable to land, could be taxed in part, maybe 10% of it, 20% of it, 100% of it, if you go all the way with a Georgist solution. So it's a tax on the rental value of land. So tenants pay it now already, 100%. And and that is also one of the reasons why we have a lot of unfairness in the housing market, because everyone's chasing the easy money. It's baking up prices higher, and it comes at the expense of working people, which is why we will always have working poverty. Because as prices go up, jobs will never keep up. We'll always have a large portion of our population living on the edge because of this connection to land value. And sorry, and I should say that there's a view in this movement. This goes back again all the way back to Adam Smith or Henry George is another reformer in the 19th century, who see that land value growth is fundamentally community created. It's created by public investments, by growth in the economy, by changes to zoning. It's created by overall global economic health. Like, no owner can change their land value. They can only change their structure value by improving it. So the general view is that the fairest tax of all would be a tax on land value because nobody earned it, right? Like, you remember during COVID, the headlines that your home makes more money than your job because it appreciated so much. The land appreciated in that year, not the property. And that's fundamentally unearned income. So it's seen that we should untax earned income and instead tax unearned income, which is land value growth. So I'll leave it there.
I mean, that's super helpful. I mean, and it's kind of interesting because I'm in the intro where I kick off this segment. I mentioned that land value taxes is a really interesting tax because it's sort of a tax that the left and the right agree on. You know, you have Milton Friedman saying it's the least worst tax. You have Stiglitz supporting it. So it's one of these interesting taxes that has kind of broad support, but hasn't really moved too much forward. Now, I wanted to unpack a little bit about what you said just to make sure kind of we're clear on some things. Now, you mentioned kind of in the full Georgist approach, we would be taxing like almost 100% of the rent value of the land, right? Is that roughly correct or close to that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So, and in your example, I mean, just to make this clear for people, I guess the idea when you talk about sort of the landlord and the tenant paying both a kind of a property tax and a land tax effectively, the idea is that suppose, you know, I'm paying $4,000 a month in rent, you know, as a tenant, but my landlord's property, half of that is the value of the property, and half of that is the rent, the land rent, or the value of the land. In the Georgist approach, roughly half of my rent would effectively go towards a land tax, effectively, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah. If you go the maximalist approach, which
Yeah.
would be the George's approach, would be even Adam Smith's approach, the land portion would be taxed, but everything else would be untaxed, would not be taxed at all.
Hmm.
Um, and by our estimations in British Columbia, because the data is easier to get there, you could actually eliminate provincial income, corporate land transfer fees, vacancy, all these other taxes, eliminate them all, and still have enough to also give all families a $7,300 rebate. And the average family in the average home at the average income would be $5,800 a head per year after this tax shift. So it seems like it's a high amount to pay, but it can come off other taxes elsewhere.
So that's interesting. Now, I mean, it's so I have a couple of questions, I guess. One is in this idea of sort of the tenant paying both a land tax and a property tax and increasing land taxes for landlords. How does that help rental affordability for me as a tenant? Like, so the landlord pays more in taxes, you know, they're paying a higher land tax. Their net rent or net income is lower, but how does that benefit renters?
Right. So first of all, I love that we jumped into the maximalist solution.
Well, okay, okay.
So, but just to
Sure.
clarify, like I just want to reframe that a very small land tax shift could
Mhm.
already help with some of the incentives. And I'll get to your question because it's a
Sure.
very good question. Like a 0.2% land value tax in Ontario could eliminate the need for any developer charges. It raise the same amount of fees. And developers have been asking for that for a while. A very small 0.2%. In Australia, in the city of Victoria, they have a small land transfer tax, and they changed some of the exemptions so it applies. Sorry, land value tax, so it applies to more people. And they saw an exodus, like almost 10% of second and third property owners sold their properties, and we had more first-time home buyers buying those properties. So let's get back to your question now.
Yeah.
Again, if you're lowering someone's income tax or even giving them a rebate, like the way we have the carbon rebate, for instance, could have a land rebate, tenants are ahead because they're being charged less for their job. And meanwhile, they're still paying the same amount on the outflow. They're still paying the same rent because the rents won't go up and down with the land transfer tax, but they're benefiting because that money is actually going to fund our life, it's going to fund our society, as opposed to going to the landlord's pocket. While reducing their income tax or even getting a rebate, depends on how it's done. So what you do with the land transfer value tax is a key point, right? It's not just about raising a tax. If you want to encourage building, you reduce property taxes dollar for dollar with it. If you want to increase productivity, we can reduce taxes on incomes, on corporate and property, and personal incomes. If we want to compensate people that are being screwed by the current system, we can include rebates, like a tax rebate from it. Because as you've probably seen, renters, the average net worth of renters is like $11,000. The average net worth of homeowners is almost $400,000.
Mhm.
That's kind of unfair, given that land value growth is not created by the homeowner.
Mhm.
So having some rebates there is a way to share in this land value growth. But so to get to your question, it'll help tenants directly because
Mhm.
they'll spend less money, so that they'll have more money in their pocket. And also, it should induce more supply. And that gets into a whole different discussion about how a land value tax reduces speculation, helps bring underutilized land to market. It should induce more supply being created, which overall should reduce rents in the long term.
So before we jump into supply, and I think that's the next thing we'll talk because it's a good point. Um, uh, your point, I think, is an interesting one. I mean, and to be clear, I kind of went with the sort of maximalist kind of. I mean, the idea is we're not going to get there tomorrow, but I think the idea, and I think for me, it's important to think about is like, what is sort of the ideal framework or that maybe we would look towards or sort of the values and kind of direction you're going, knowing full well that you're not changing a country's tax system overnight,
Mhm.
that there's a progress and there's some progression to it. And I do agree. I mean, I think your point is a very valid one that, as you're taxing land more and reducing income taxes, I mean, that is obviously a very net benefits to people, certainly income earners who pay far more in taxes on their labor. Yeah, there are many social benefits to it. So I do kind of hear what you're saying on that. Now, let's kind of chat a little bit and go kind of pivot onto the supply side. And you talked about how it curbs speculation and encourages more supply. Maybe you can kind of unpack some of those ideas for us.
Yeah, and this is all debated vigorously on Twitter. Some say it doesn't do that, but I can explain some of the theory. Right now, I'm curious what you think. I mean, is our housing market reflects real supply and demand for homes, or is it reflecting speculative intentions?
Well,
You
I
know?
mean, I think it's both. I mean, I think the prices reflect speculative intentions, but the demand is certainly real demand.
Yeah,
Um,
right. So that's exactly where I'm coming from. So what we want is a real estate market to act more like a services market to reflect the real cost of the service, as opposed to speculative profit motives. This means that in a better functioning economy, good money is made by constructing, good money is made by offering a property for rent, maintaining it, improving it, but not a lot of money is made by just holding. But that's the golden goose everyone wants. Everyone wants to buy a property and wait for the price to go up. But that's incompatible with having affordability because you can't simultaneously expect something to be a good investment in terms of long-term appreciation, but expect it to be affordable for people coming in to buy homes. You just can't. So we're living with this cognitive dissonance, and we've been living with it for a long time. And land value tax provides a solution because the higher the land value tax, the less the value accrues to the owner, because the LVT should increase as land value grows. That curbs speculators. It makes them not want to invest in this market anymore. They'll invest in the stocks or other things, frankly, that are more productive for society. I think it will start to smoothen the curves of booms and busts, and have prices reflect more what we need as a service market than a speculative market. And that's what the theory says, and what we have seen through numerous studies around the world, that there is a one-to-one relationship between the amount of land tax and the price of land. Like it's capitalized directly in. So if you have a higher land tax, the price of land goes down. And in our estimations for BC, again in the maximalist solution, taxing three-quarters of the rental value of land would bring down the price of land by 75%, and the average home would be like 50 to 60% lower cost to acquire as a result, which means less mortgages. It means getting the middlemen out of the pricing game. Banks through excess mortgages, mom and pop investors like just buying for long-term appreciation shouldn't be setting the floor in prices. It should be people's need to live or rent, and not people's desire to buy an asset and to hold it for long term. So that's how it affects the demand side. Now, on the supply side, I think we have a big problem with underutilized land. When you look at the footprint of downtown Toronto, why isn't the skyscraper profile like 3-4 times more landmass than it currently is? We of course you'll see it's zoning, it's a lot of things, but at the end of the day, um, we have a lot of underutilized land, and because we don't have a pricing mechanism through our tax system to help um, make it unaffordable to keep land underutilized so that it would get more units where they're needed.
That's super helpful. Now, you kind of touched on a few things. I think Ermi had a question about kind of development, but before we go there, I mean, one thing I kind of wanted to chat a little bit about was this idea of, you mentioned if you're taxing land, land value goes down. I mean, which to me makes sense. And I guess one thing I'm trying to wrap my head around in the context again of rental properties, of all of this is, are we that much further ahead? Like at the end of the day, if an investor who has a multiplex is paying far more in land value taxes, at the end of the day, they're only going to buy that rental property if the total property of that asset goes down. Like investors need to make a certain return. You can't just double their taxes overnight.
Right.
And what likely happens is just more of the value is assigned to the structure and a lot less on the land tax. And I wonder how that flows through when you're talking about taxing land, because by taxing it more, you're actually driving the value of the land down and you're making the land rent less importance to the investor and the rent from the actual property more important. So, and I think that's kind of one of the struggles I've had when reading about this. I think when I read about sort of these forecasts or projections about land value taxes impacting the market, it is this idea of everything is the same now. The value of the property is X, the value of the land, we're just going to triple the value of the land and everything's going to stay the same. And it's not going to stay the same.
I'm not going to say the same. It shouldn't.
Yes.
So I own 11 units through 6 properties. So I think about this from a landlord's perspective, right? And at the end of the day, if land is underutilized, if it's not being put to its most productive use, then the cash flows won't work out. So in the example you gave, if we're increasing the value of the property, we're untaxing the rental income to the landlord from the property. They have all the incentive to add more units, to build more where it's needed.
But it's not
It's
that
something to
easy,
lose.
though. It's not that easy to just build another unit.
Of
Like,
course not. But we're talking about, I guess I didn't mention it, but any serious commentator on this would say you should do the tax shift very slowly and probably over 10 to 20 years if you're going all the way to the maximalist solution,
mhm.
which that would require multiple successive governments to agree that this is a good solution.
Yeah.
In reality, even a small tax shift, even just eliminating property tax and having land tax only would be a relatively small shift, would leave the vast majority of households ahead cash flow wise, and would provide these signals to induce more construction in the areas where land is most underutilized. So what you're saying is exactly the point. We want to make it so that you profit more from offering units for rent than simply holding or
Mhm.
having underutilized land.
Okay.
I mean, remember the days when you can get 5% cap rates in Toronto?
For sure.
Like, don't we want that again? Like, this is
Sure.
how we'll get there.
So I have thoughts, but I'm going to turn it to Ermi before I kind of keep rambling.
Well, first of all, I appreciate taking the maximal approach. When you're looking at any theory, it helps to understand what that might look like. But I do take your point, Floyd, that when we talk about the political applications, we're probably talking about incrementalism.
Yeah.
So I was wondering a couple of concepts that hits the public when it comes to taxes and fairness, which is a little bit different than mathematically what might end up being the most efficient for all. Because sometimes that doesn't even, that doesn't convince people. Talking about developers, we were speaking to Matt Young, a recent guest on our show. He leads the Coalition Against New Home Taxes, Can't, yes, I think that's the acronym. Their website's cantwin.ca. And I would summarize this argument as broadly being an argument for a tax shift away from what we might term user-based taxes, so development charges on developers, or HST on new home sales, so the purchases of those are paying it. And the argument was offset that with having a more increases to property tax, a more broad-based tax, and that's more fair. It's not fair to overload the users. Now, I'm interested to hear you introduce a new concept called the service-based tax. And I'm wondering where in that continuum does the land value tax and the service-based idea fit?
Yeah, actually, what I'm proposing is exactly what you concluded that Matt was asking for. If he's saying that we should have, instead of charging all these developer fees, let's just have a small increase to property taxes. I mean, that is basically what's being proposed here. I mentioned a 0.2% land tax that's annualized across the province would raise the same amount of revenue as all the developer charges do. So it's a small amount to increase tax by on everyone, which increases as land value grows. So, I mean, I have a couple of developer friends, and they say they'd much rather pay a higher carrying cost temporarily while their project is on the go than pay these like big, huge charges. It's easier to understand, it's easier to administer, it's easier to account for in their cash flow planning. So when I said a services-based housing market, what I meant is that if you go all the way, like a maximalist solution, money's only made by offering a service. It's made by building something and selling it. It's made by renting something, someone else maintaining it. It's made by improving your property and then selling it. Like there's nothing wrong with improving and flipping. You're adding value in some ways to society. What's unfair is if you're just holding it and cashing in on economic growth around you that you didn't do anything to earn. And then the next guy has to pay more just to access a home. Like that's where the unfairness is, that the next generation has to pay more to access a home to live than the previous ones did, and they never worked for that land value growth. So we should make money by renovating, by improving, not by just sitting on something. So that's where land tax is seen from a fairness lens, and it could reduce all those other taxes that Matt Young had mentioned.
I'm seeing this a bit as being the flip side of the whole externalities argument. When you're trying to put a cost on something, let's say pollution, air pollution, water pollution, that is hard to attribute to one user. This is almost the flip side of the gains being hard to attribute to any one user. I remember during a certain campaign, I think Obama was trying to point out why business taxes should go up, because they depend on all the infrastructure. When a business builds, it doesn't just rely on its own wherewithal. But we see a lot of pushback on those kind of efforts. How plausible do you think it is that the Canadian public is ready to think about the collective benefits of land values increasing and that we all contribute to it?
Well, when we hit our next mega crash, which I think will come around 2007 or 8, maybe we'll be more open to it. In the meantime, even a small land tax shift can, again, improve people's overall tax position while change some of the incentives that are affecting the housing market today. You guys are in the housing market, you might want to know about this. And people who've studied land transfer tax, who call themselves Georgists, have a model that shows that there's a crash every 18 and a half years, and it's driven by rising land values. And by this model, 2026 will be the peak, and then it'll start to come down. And then when housing prices come down, eventually you have an overall economic crash too. And we saw that in 2008. Like house prices started to come down after 2006, and 2008 was the big crash. So pay attention, real estate investors. But
that, yeah, and that leads to my final question before I toss it back to John. Yes, but after 2008, we didn't see, even though there was that crash, whole-scale changes to the way our market operates, at least not south of the border and here. Sure, there was tighter underwriting, a lot of things stopped, but then we saw as things sort of righted themselves, the underwriting gets looser, we go looser on the mortgage, right? So it's not as if every crash has resulted in that mind shift. But leaving that to one side, I think there's another issue that complicates this matter in Canada, it being a federation. When you're talking about people will accept a small shift up in property taxes if it's being recalibrated a little bit by your land transfer sort of land value idea. So the idea is your property taxes will be calculated on a slightly different basis, but the idea is that it would go up, right? Overall. Now, that's been in Toronto, for example, a political no-go. People are very afraid. We are legendarily known for our low property tax compared to even municipalities right next to us, because the politicians are afraid to ask people that are house rich, I guess cash poor, and all, seniors and other groups fit into this category, to take a hit on their property taxes or to pay more. The most recent interesting use I saw of this was the mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, threatening Torontonians that she would hike their property taxes up by 10% if the federal government and the provincial government didn't give the city more money. So saying this would be Trudeau's fault. Now, that all, resulted in the usual, press comments and dirt throwing, but without a guaranteed coordination that if my property taxes go up, my tax goes down. I mean, are you really going to be able to sell even a small increase in property tax?
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. Like in the purest, in my personal vision of the purest solution here, it would be a direct tax and rebate, so people actually get cash back, and we're doing it in order to improve the incentives affecting the housing market. To stop underutilized land, to reduce distortionary taxes. It wouldn't be necessarily one-to-one. Like you could again eliminate land transfer taxes, which are terrible, so much money on land transfer taxes. Reduce developer charges and reduce some income taxes from the bottom, and then maybe rebate half of the revenue that's earned, so that majority of households are in a positive net cash flow position. Now some might be suspicious because look at all the demonization of the carbon tax and rebate. Even if it actually does leave households ahead, people don't like it. But with housing, it's different because everyone knows prices are too high. If we can actually see prices come down because this tax causes that to happen, and you get money in your bank account, like maybe it'll be different. But I think we could start on the small. We could start in Ontario with allowing cities to experiment with shifting property tax towards a land tax. That's one way to do it. A province could do it province-wide. This is not a national, overall Canadian collaborative effort. It would better to happen local or provincial at best if you're going to impact income taxes.
Now, I wanted to kind of ask you a few questions you touched on earlier on, this idea of land value taxes kind of curbing speculation. And I'm trying to wrap around my head around that because my sense is, I think when I hear, people advocate that it kind of curbs speculation, my instincts, or at least it sounds like they're talking about curbing land speculation, meaning, builders just sitting on land and not developing it. If that's the argument, then, I mean, the belief is that the only reason they're not building is obviously to capitalize on the land. But I guess, is that really the big issue, land speculation? Like in Canada, at least in Toronto, the speculation isn't so much in the land, it's in the unit, right? So if we are taking the full Georgist approach, that 20,000 square foot downtown parking lot, the tax on that doesn't change if you add a 50-story tower with 600 units on it, right?
Right.
Which in theory I would think means that the actual tax the unit owner pays might not be much different from what they're paying today, right? So how does that kind of curb condo speculation in this environment? Like it may even be less than what they're paying today if you add that much value to this small parcel of land. So that's kind of one thing I just couldn't wrap my head around. How does it curb speculation in the condominium market, for example?
Yeah. So again, I want to learn from you guys too. You're in the market. I'm a systems thinker looking at it from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about speculation, yes, there's also the example of underutilized land. So, for the listeners, if you have a parking lot next to a skyscraper and you occupy the same amount of land in the same location, they pay the same land tax. So if you had a land tax, which we don't have it now, the parking lot would be priced out. It simply could no longer function as a parking lot. So it would pretty quickly become something more useful to society. And like 10 stories of parking lot with 20 stories of apartments on top. That would be much more useful for society in that location. So that's good, right? So there's the example of stopping speculation, stopping the development of land, stopping the underdevelopment of land, which is for speculative reasons, because it's easier for the landlord to do nothing with it and just wait for the price to keep going up. You've heard famously another example of people intentionally keeping their properties unrented because in a very bullish market, they don't have an incentive to get it rented because it kind of locks the actual income return that they can now justify for selling it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So they just keep it empty. So it would stop that too, because it would be unaffordable to keep it empty. Like we don't need foreign buyers taxes and all these taxes. Like the land tax would resolve that for that particular example. So these are about withholding land. But you asked a different question. You asked about this, the actual buying of condo units. And this is where I think we have two markets that are in conflict with each other. I think you've tweeted similar examples. You have the market of buyers who are buying with the intention to have a long-term appreciating asset, and you have the market of buyers who just want to have their own home and like customize it and not pay rent. So those two markets are in conflict. The higher the land tax, the less attractive it is to buy condos for as a second or third property, unless you're doing it with a handyman's sort of a mentality that this is a service you're offering, and you're going to make money off the yield, not make money off the appreciation. Making money off cash yield is a service. It's a good business. It's a very just business. But that's not what we have today. We have today a system, especially in the big cities, where landlords are not incentivized to do any repairs or renovations because they can just wait and the value will go up anyway, and they can charge more rent to the next newcomer without doing any work at all. That's insane. Like I know that incentive. I have units too, and it's kind of heartbreaking. If I want to make the hallway in the common area looks nicer, I'm just doing it out of the goodness of my heart because there's no actual reason to it. It won't really change the amount of rent I can collect next year. So we should have a system where you earn your increase in rent by adding value, by building units or by renovating. You don't just wait and that you can charge more next year because of something that happened in society around you. So that's what we're talking about here. But again, directly to your question, these two markets are in conflict. The investors and the homeowners are in conflict. So by having a higher carrying cost for those units, I think you're going to have less competition between those two markets. More units will be built for families, and at prices set by families, not by middlemen, not by the mom and pop investors buying to hold and rent it to others. You're not going to have people buying in a negative cash flow position as they are now, because it'll be even more negative. Like it'll be crazy. Because again, if they're waiting for land value to appreciate to realize a return when they sell one day to build equity that way. But if land value appreciates and they end up paying more, they're not getting that value back. So it changes the reason they'd invest. You should invest for cash yield, not for appreciation. Not when it comes to something mission like critical like housing.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think certainly when it comes to investors buying detached homes, I think that makes sense. Obviously, it would be harder to float that as an investment. I think my point maybe, and I wasn't clear, is when it comes to condos, I don't know if the end result of a land value tax on condos would be that different from what we have today. Because if you take the land value tax for that little 20,000 square foot parcel of land and drop in 800 or 600 units and spread that tax over all of them, I mean, we would have achieved the point. They've added value and their tax per unit is a lot lower because of the value added, right? And that condo investor would realize a lower tax burden because the value has been added. And I think that's kind of all I was saying. I wasn't sure if we would curb speculation of condo investors with a land value tax. Certainly, I think you'd curb it for people loading up on low-rise homes because that would be a lot harder, right? Now, I mean, when we think about low-rise homes, maybe I'll wrap up with one or two more questions. One thing I've kind of struggled with and I think about is that in a lot of Ontario or, and even in the GTA until recently or Toronto, most properties or most areas really only allow low-rise single-family homes. Like if in most cases, just like a detached home, right? And I guess one thing I had trouble wrapping around my head is this, and I get your point, this idea that if you have a little bungalow, it's underutilized. We should invest more and build housing. That kind of makes sense in theory, but I guess the one thing I struggle with is taxing the senior who has the little bungalow the same as someone who tears it down and builds a $3 million McMansion. I mean, on the one hand, it feels like we're subsidizing the person who's building the $3 million McMansion, right? And I think part of property taxes obviously is designed to capture part of that value increase, so it feels more equitable. But in the kind of the land value tax world, the senior in a little bungalow should pay the same as someone who has a $5 million McMansion because they've kind of added value to the property. So they should have to pay tax on that increase, I guess, is kind of the idea, right?
Okay, let's unpack that. So it depends on where, right? This is not an attack on single family homes. Depends where they are. If they're on the periphery where they should be in the suburbs, then that's fine. I mean, its prices might even come down because the land value is worth a bit less the further you are from the center. So where the bungalow is a problem is in Parkdale or in North York or around Kensington Market, where you're right next to downtown, and there's there's like 1- and 2-story homes in that area. The Danforth area. Why isn't the Danforth covered in buildings? We have a housing crisis. What's going on? It's just crazy. Look at the city profile of Toronto. Why isn't the actual high-rise portion triple the size if you look at the footprint of the city? So it's not about being against or outpricing seniors in their homes. It's really about where, and is that land used sufficiently given the value of that land. It is perfectly fine to have tons of single family homes in the periphery where that is the appropriate use of land, the most productive use of land, but not near the downtowns, not near areas of major public value like subway stations and major works like Ontario Place. You want density where the value calls for it, and land value tax creates this pricing signal to let the market start to move towards that over time, not overnight, right? So we're not talking about overnight pricing out seniors living in the Danforth. We're talking about over time, knowing this is coming. People can make the best decision for their own financial position, and that over time, eventually, the value of the land should match the number of units on it, and this is what we would move towards. Now, you brought up the mansion example. It is highly unlikely someone will want to own a mansion in an area where the land is so underutilized, they'd have to pay an extra $100,000 or $200,000 a year just to hold that mansion. Why would they? Maybe they want to hold a 3,000 square foot condo instead, or hold a mansion further out of town instead of close to downtown. So that's it. Really depends on where that location value is, and I think the economics would work out so that maybe there's some rich areas like Bridle Path that they pay even more to frankly keep that land away from public use, and there's a bit of fairness to that. If they're paying more for the land they're withholding from the public for these mansions in one big area, then at least they're paying for it. But I don't think that math would work out closer to transit or close to downtown where you need more skyscrapers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and to your point, I mean, about the underutilization, I mean, all of this, of course, is a function of, again, municipal policies. Up until, I mean, what was it, a year ago or a year and a half ago, in most of Toronto, you could only have a single family home on it, and in most cases, detached. It's only recently where you could build a fourplex on it. But
why doesn't Toronto look more like Manhattan? Fourplex, it's a joke. All those areas around the downtown core should be much higher.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is that's a tough question. I feel like this is what the YIMBY movement's all about. I mean, I think the challenge with that is there's obviously history and legacy. This is how Toronto was built, I think everyone wants to just drop a bomb on it and restart from scratch and make Toronto look like Paris, which obviously is not that easy. So yeah, do we need more density? Yeah, but obviously there are people living in homes now. And I agree with you. I mean, four units maybe is obviously not enough, especially in some areas close to transit in downtown. But you can't make Toronto look like Manhattan tomorrow. I mean,
no, again,
right?
we're talking about incentives that will lead long term to the outcomes that we want.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point again about seniors, in any serious transition plan, like a 10 or 20-year transition plan, there's allowances for seniors to defer it until they eventually pass or to eventually sell. And again, in the model that we're championing at Commonwealth Canada,
Mm-hmm.
it includes half the revenue would pay for rebates, so people actually get cash, maybe over $7,000 a year cash coming to you, which helps with affordability, helps renters, helps seniors. And so yeah, we want a system that leaves most of us better off, but changes the incentives so that we build housing where it's needed, we build enough of it, and we stop this this dichotomy between investors and homeowners competing with each other on price.
My final question is, we are hearing a lot on the housing advocacy front about this argument for densification. As John has mentioned, governments of many different levels are advocating finally for more to change zoning for densification. What are the risks that a shift towards taxing land more would result in sprawling? So running out to get land that is cheaper relatively and build monster homes. So it's like a different kind of competition between end users, let's say, of houses, of low-rise detached houses. Wouldn't this be moving away from some of the principles that we are trying to build on in terms of building more, like you were saying, cost effective, also infrastructure effective, denser housing? Couldn't this risk doing the opposite in a place like Canada and especially Ontario, everywhere where there is so much land to be built on?
Love to ask that question because the current system encourages sprawl, right? The current system encourages sprawl. People are moving further and further away to find an affordable place to live, which is literally sapping our lives. Like to have a 2-hour commute. Like since when did Toronto become like LA? This is insane. Like we're literally like losing our livelihoods in long commutes. Like the current system encourages sprawl because we're not developing sufficiently where the density is needed. People are moving further away to build units. And that's a huge problem with the current system. So, I mean, land value tax advocates are pretty unanimous that it should reduce sprawl because cities should look more like bell curves, where you have more density where it's needed, which would increase affordability, which more people would want to live close to town, close to areas where there's more community, where we have access to more amenities because it's cheaper. And those who just really want to have the backyard can keep moving to places like Milton. But the point is there'll be enough options in the city to provide working people with affordable options that they won't have to move far away if they don't want to. So that's like a key point is that it should reduce sprawl by building enough where it's needed, as opposed to encouraging sprawl, which we have today.
Super helpful. We chatted a lot today. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to talk about that maybe we didn't ask you before we kind of wrap up today's segment.
Yeah, I mean, like I think about this again. I really want to know what you guys think about this. Like, you've commented a lot on X about about housing as an asset versus a place to live. I mean, this is a solution. If you definancialize the long-term return of housing because you're literally taxing its rental, the land value, rental yield, you're reducing the appreciation from land value that an investor can expect.
Mhm.
Housing should start to reflect its actual supply and dynamic cost for people's need to live. That's a lot of words. Sorry, that's a bit early here. And like that's a means to change the investor incentive towards adding value, building, renovating, renting, not holding. Like, do you think that would work? And if not, like, I don't know, what other solutions are there?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think where I stand is generally, I mean, higher property taxes make more sense. It's a more intelligent way of the city financing, a lot of its infrastructure rather than, charging an unbelievably amount on building new housing. That is completely backwards. I think Ermi mentioned in an episode of I mean, the way they're taxing housing, it's like a vice tax, the way you tax cigarettes, they increase it so much that they're trying to actually discourage it. So I certainly think that approach makes more sense. I guess where I'm not 100% confident and convinced on the land value tax idea is that I don't know if it necessarily just needs to be on the land value. And I think the one example I gave where I do not know what that looks like when you're building a condo tower. And my instinct is the condo units land value tax would probably be lower than what they're paying even in property taxes today if you only taxed the land value and you did not take into account the massive improvement. So I get philosophically why I think there are some good ideas with it, but I just wonder if you actually extend that out, if you just take the land rent on this parcel and spread it out over a new 600 unit building, what does that look like? And are the taxes that different? And I don't know if they will be. And I think that's kind of where I think some of the challenges I have with the core idea and that's really just the difference. It's, taxing land values and property values versus just the unimproved value, where I'm kind of mixed on.
Well, what you said is a good thing. It's a good thing if you live in a 600 unit building and you pay less overall in tax, because that's encouraging more condos. It's inducing more development. Like that's a good thing. We want that,
No,
right?
but I disagree with you because I don't think it encourages more development because when you tax the landowner more, right? Like, and if it's significant, like obviously it's marginal, it's not a huge deal, but if it's significant, that flows through to their pro formas and their construction costs the way development charges to, right? The developer does not care about what the taxes are on the finished product because they're not paying them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's like, imagine you have like a massive subdivision and you're taxing it like land value and you finish it and you build 1,000 homes. Well, their taxes on 1,000 homes is going to be actually minuscule if it's just 1,000th of the land value tax. Right. So, and the developer doesn't care about that because they've sold the properties. They don't care what the taxes are on the finished homes. And I think that's the struggle I have with it. And in some ways, it feels actually potentially like a subsidy in some cases to, investors, to homeowners in some cases. And obviously in the cases where you talk about where the land's underutilized, it makes sense. But anywhere where you have a detached home and all you can build is a detached home, it's not underutilized land, right? And or in a case of you build a condo tower, it's no longer underutilized, right? And I think that's the tension I have. Like you might actually get low, and to your point, yeah, if you get lower taxes on the condo units, that actually may encourage more speculation on condo units. I think that's the tension I have, right? So the difference between land taxes and taxing property. So I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on it, but generally, principally, I agree with you. Taxing properties more, whether it's the combination of both, it does flow through the economy, makes housing more affordable, and we see that in all sorts of places. So,
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I could try and reply to some of those points if you like, or we could wrap up. It's.
I mean, you can, sure. I mean, I'll let you kind of wrap up, and yeah.
Okay, no, I mean, I love that we're ending with those concerns, and obviously, I want to convince you because you're an influencer, and I don't know where Irving stands on this, but I mean, if again the land value tax increases as land value increases, it's self-defeating that it would create more speculation because then the land value tax goes up. The value of land stays fairly static. It increases very slowly in such a scenario. So I don't see how it could create more speculation. It might increase the profitability of building condos because more people want them because they're lower cost than living in homes, but they're already low cost living homes now. That's why people live in condos. So this makes them even cheaper and encourages even more development because their carrying costs are lower because it reflects, frankly, it's more environmentalist. We're sharing land better. More people on a smaller footprint is preserving nature in some ways. So your reward for doing that is you have a smaller overall tax bill, which means more people want to live maybe in condos near downtown. Then developers have more of a business model, more revenue, more opportunities to develop. So anyway, I hope that kind of touches on it. Yeah, it's not about speculation. It's about driving business to produce solutions society needs where it needs it, and this fixes those.
And I think, okay, I agree with you. I'm going to wrap up with one last thought, and I'll let you follow up on it if you want.
Right?
Where I agree and we disagree. I think if you have someone who owns land and
Yeah.
they're building a purpose-built rental project that will be permanent rental housing, okay? In some ways, I see the benefit of a land value tax because all the benefit of the improvement flows through to the person who's making the investment and they hold on to it, right? So that makes sense. In the context of a condominium, the person building it doesn't get the benefit of the lower taxes on the improved land. The condo investor who buys it does, right? So, and I think that's the disconnect I get. It makes sense when it's the person who builds it, maintains it, because they get that benefit that the improved land is not taxed anymore, right? But in the context of condominiums, that benefit flows through in the form of proportionally lower taxes to condo unit owners. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. So the developer benefits because they're paying a high carrying cost for the land, but probably smaller overall than they're paying today because it's temporary, and the cost they would pay is spread out over generations to come because it's a permanent change. Like I mentioned, a 0.2% land value tax would raise the same amount of revenue as all of the developer charges in Ontario right now.
Mhm.
So would a developer prefer to pay 0.2% of the land value for the 5 to 10 years they're holding land for the project? Or they prefer to pay these huge developer charges on the increased value that the zoning cost?
But if they're equal, what's the difference? If I pay it over 5 or 7 years that I own it versus ones at the end?
Because it's not the developer paying it. It's the future homeowner paying it over.
Oh, you're saying the charges over a longer period. Okay, I see what you're saying. Sure. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, this has
Okay.
been fun.
That was helpful. Awesome. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.